25 years ago, this homeless man adopted 2 children. This is how they repaid him many years later. The camera flashes were blinding. Liam Matthews, with his confident posture and compassionate eyes, stood at the podium accepting the Humanitarian Award for Medical Excellence. At 42, he had become one of the country's most celebrated neurosurgeons, pioneering affordable treatments for previously untreatable conditions. Dr. Matthews, does your background in foster care inspire your free clinic initiatives? A reporter called out. Liam's fingers tightened around the crystal award. I never went through the foster system, he corrected gently. My sister and I were raised by someone who taught us more about humanity than any institution could. In the front row, Sophie Matthews dabbed at her eyes. At 39, she had built Matthews Outreach, a nationwide network creating sustainable housing communities for people experiencing homelessness. Her innovative approach had been featured in every major publication, and tonight she would receive her own award for social innovation. The siblings exchanged a glance across the crowded ballroom, a silent acknowledgement of the absence they both felt keenly on nights like these. Later, as the evening wound down and the interviews began, a persistent journalist cornered them both. You've both refused to discuss your childhood in previous interviews, she said, the recording device extended. Your official biographies simply state you were raised in humble circumstances. What's the real story? Sophie's usual media smile faltered. Our story isn't remarkable. What matters is... But it is remarkable, Liam interrupted, placing a hand on his sister's shoulder. We owe everything to a man named Ethan Carter. The journalist leaned forward. Your father? Not biologically, Sophie replied, her voice suddenly thick with emotion. But in every way that matters. He was homeless when he found us. The journalist's eyebrows shot up. Homeless? Are you saying? I'm saying, Liam continued firmly, that the most important medical education I ever received wasn't at Harvard. It was watching Ethan wrap my infected foot with the only clean bandage he had, while his own wounds went untreated. 25 years earlier. The rain fell in icy sheets, soaking through Ethan's threadbare coat as he huddled in the narrow passage between 2 dumpsters. Once, he'd worn surgical scrubs in climate-controlled operating rooms. Now, at 43, he wore whatever clothes the shelter had available. The sounds caught his attention, soft whimpering, almost inaudible beneath the drumming rain. Ethan froze, listening. There it was again. Hello? He called softly, peering deeper into the alley. A small face appeared from behind a stack of discarded produce crates. A boy, no more than 10, with a defiant glare that couldn't mask his terror. It's okay, Ethan said, keeping his distance. Are you hurt? We're fine, the boy answered, emphasizing the plural. Just leave us alone. Ethan's medical instincts kicked in. Us? Reluctantly, the boy stepped aside, revealing a smaller figure huddled against the wall, a little girl, perhaps 7, shivering violently. She's sick, the boy admitted, his bravado cracking. But I'm taking care of her. Ethan approached slowly, kneeling despite the shooting pain in his bad knee. The little girl's forehead was burning with fever. I'm Ethan, he said gently. I used to be a doctor. May I help? The boy hesitated, then nodded. I'm Liam. That's Sophie. Our mom left 3 days ago to get medicine. She hasn't come back. Ethan felt a painful twisting in his chest. He recognized the story, not the details, but the abandonment. Some parents returned. Many never did. Sophie needs to get warm and dry, he said, professional calm masking his concern. I know a place. Will you trust me? The shelter had no space that night, but Marcy, the night manager who had a soft spot for Ethan, let them use the staff break room. Just tonight, Carter, she warned. And those kids need social services in the morning. Ethan nodded, knowing what that meant: separation, foster care, the system. He'd seen what happened to siblings there. By morning, Sophie's fever had broken. She sat cross-legged on the break room couch, nibbling a donated pastry while Liam hovered protectively nearby. You really were a doctor? Liam asked skeptically. Ethan nodded, not elaborating on the car accident that had left him with crippling medical debt, or the prescription drug dependency that followed as he tried to manage the pain, or how quickly a respected surgeon could lose everything. "What happens now?" Sophie asked quietly. "Now we find you somewhere safe to stay," Ethan answered the "we," slipping out unintentionally. 3 months later, they were still together. Ethan had found work doing maintenance at an office building, under-the-table pay that wouldn't affect his disability application. They lived in a single room at the back of a church that ran a shelter program. He enrolled the children in school, using an address borrowed from a sympathetic former colleague. Every night, despite his exhaustion, Ethan helped with homework. Every morning, he woke before dawn to prepare their lunches from the food bank supplies. When Liam's shoes fell apart, Ethan sold his father's watch, his last possession of value, to buy new ones. One night, as he tucked Sophie into her cot, she asked, "Are you going to leave us too?" Ethan's throat tightened. "No, Sophie. I promise I won't." Present day. He kept that promise, Sophie told the journalist, her voice steady despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. For 15 years he kept it. He worked 3 jobs sometimes. He taught us everything, not just reading and math, but ethics, compassion, dignity. "How did he manage to raise you without authorities intervening?" the journalist asked. "Creatively," Liam answered with a sad smile. "Sometimes we lived in shelters, sometimes in rooms rented weekly. Once, we lived in the basement of the hospital where he'd found work as a janitor. Always under the radar. And where is he now? This remarkable man?" The silence between the siblings stretched uncomfortably long. "That's what we'd like to know," Sophie finally admitted. 5 years ago, he stopped answering our calls. His phone was disconnected. None of our usual contacts had seen him. We thought he might be. Liam's voice faltered. "But there's no death certificate, no record at all. So tonight," Sophie continued, sudden determination hardening her voice, "we're making it official. We're looking for Ethan Carter. And we're not stopping until we find him." As the journalist hurried away to file her story, Liam turned to his sister. "Are we really doing this?" Sophie nodded, guilt and hope warring in her expression. "We should have started years ago. What if he's been out there all this time, still struggling, while we've been enjoying the life he sacrificed everything to give us?" Liam stared at the award in his hands, suddenly seeing not an achievement but a question. How could he have healed so many strangers while forgetting the one man who had saved him? The bustling homeless shelter on 43rd Street hadn't changed much in 20 years. The same fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Liam stood in the doorway, memories flooding back, Ethan helping him with multiplication tables at these very tables, Sophie sleeping against Ethan's shoulder during the long waits for a bed. "Dr. Matthews!" The shelter coordinator, a middle-aged woman named Darlene, rushed forward. "We got your donation last month. You have no idea how much that MRI machine has helped." "I'm not here as a donor today," Liam said quietly. "I'm looking for someone. Ethan Carter." Darlene's smile faltered. "Ethan? I haven't heard that name in years." She gestured toward her cramped office. "But come in. We keep records." Sophie joined them, clutching a small photo album containing their few pictures of Ethan. Most shelters had rejected their inquiries over the phone. Privacy policies, they said. But showing up in person, with their recognizable faces and checkbooks, opened doors. "Here," Darlene said, handing them a ledger. "He last stayed here 8 years ago. Just for a week." 8 years, Sophie whispered. "That's 3 years after we lost contact." Liam studied the signature beside Ethan's name, recognizing the careful script that had once checked his homework. "Does it say where he went?" Darlene shook her head. "But Marvin might know. He's been here forever." Marvin, the elderly night watchman, remembered Ethan immediately. Good man. Quiet. Always reading something. Medical journals, if I recall. He rubbed his whiskered chin. "He was sick last time I saw him." Bad cough. Said he was heading to St. Anthony's. St. Anthony's Medical Center was the next stop in their search. The administrative assistant recognized them instantly. Liam from medical conferences, Sophie from charity galas. But Ethan's name meant nothing to her until she searched the records. He was treated in the emergency department 6 years ago, she told them, frowning at her computer screen. Pneumonia. Insurance status, none. Payment method, charity care. Sophie's hands clenched into fists. Charity care? At this hospital? Her voice rose. We've donated millions to this hospital. We didn't know, Liam said softly, placing a hand on her arm. He never told us. The search continued for days. They visited every shelter, clinic, and soup kitchen in the city. Some remembered Ethan, most didn't. The bits of information they gathered painted a fragmented picture. Ethan had worked as a night janitor at the community college, had volunteered at a literacy program despite his own poverty, had been seen sleeping in the park during the summer of 2019. It's like chasing a shadow, Sophie said one evening, as they sat surrounded by maps marked with Ethan's last known locations. We have his full name, his date of birth, his social security number. How can he just disappear? Liam rubbed his eyes. He spent his life staying invisible. It was how he kept us safe. Their breakthrough came from an unexpected source. An article about their search appeared in the Sunday paper, featuring the few photographs they had of Ethan. The next morning, a woman called Sophie's office. I have something that belongs to him, she said. He left it at my boarding house years ago. The boarding house was in a neglected part of town, a once dignified Victorian home now divided into cramped units. The landlady, Mrs. Winters, led them to a basement storage area filled with abandoned possessions. Tenants leave, can't pay, she explained, pulling out a battered cardboard box. I keep their things for a year, then usually donate them. But this... She handed Sophie a leather-bound journal. This seemed too personal to throw away. The journal was unmistakably Ethan's, filled with his neat handwriting. Sophie opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were not daily entries as expected, but letters, dozens of them, addressed to Liam and Sophie. October 15th, 2015. My dear ones, Liam, I saw your name in the medical journal today. The research you're doing on neuroregeneration, I couldn't understand all of it, but I know it's important. I'm so proud. Sophie, the shelter program you started in Chicago is precisely what's needed. You always could see solutions where others saw only problems. He was following our careers, Sophie whispered, turning pages. Even after we lost contact. The entries continued for years, documenting his pride in their accomplishments, reminiscing about their childhood together. But as the dates progressed, the handwriting became shakier, the entries shorter. March 3, 2019. The doctor says the treatments aren't working anymore. I've decided not to try the experimental option. The copay alone would fund Sophie's new housing initiative for a month. Better use of resources. Liam's medical training made the subtext clear. He was seriously ill, he said hoarsely, and refusing treatment because of the cost. The final entries were difficult to read, the handwriting deteriorating. June 17, 2019. I've made arrangements. You won't have to worry about funeral expenses or anything like that. I've donated my body to the medical school. Seems fitting. I couldn't finish my career as a doctor, but I can still teach something. I won't contact you about this. You have your own lives now, your own families forming. My greatest achievement was raising you to not need me anymore. The last page had been torn out. There's something else, Mrs. Winters said, reaching deeper into the box. She pulled out a creased newspaper clipping, a small article about a medical clinic opening in a low-income neighborhood. Liam's clinic. At the bottom, in Ethan's handwriting, he did it. Everything was worth it. Back in the car, Sophie clutched the journal to her chest. He was sick, Liam. Really sick. And we had no idea. We have to find out what happened, Liam said, starting the engine. If he's still alive. And if he's not, Liam's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Then we need to know where he is. He deserves to be properly remembered. As they drove away, Sophie opened the journal again, studying a water-stained hospital bracelet that had been pressed between the pages. The patient number was faded but legible. At the bottom was stamped, St. Francis Hospice. Liam, she said quietly. I think I know where to look next. The drive to St. Francis Hospice took them through a part of the city Sophie and Liam rarely visited. Blocks of abandoned factories and boarded-up storefronts that stood as silent monuments to economic decline. Rain pelted the windshield as night fell, turning the street signs difficult to read. Are you sure this is right? Sophie asked, squinting at her phone's GPS. It says we've arrived, but... Liam slowed the car, peering through the downpour at a dilapidated building with a faded sign. St. Francis Care Center, he read aloud. This can't be it. But it was. What had once been St. Francis Hospice had closed years ago, reopening as a bare-bones palliative care facility for those with nowhere else to go. The front desk was staffed by a young volunteer who looked up from her textbook when they entered, droplets of rain still clinging to their coats. We're closed to visitors, she said automatically, then recognition dawned on her face. Wait, you're Dr. Matthews. I saw you speak at the medical school last month. Liam nodded, too focused on his mission to engage in the usual pleasantries. We're looking for information about a former patient. Ethan Carter. The volunteer, her name tag read, Jenny, hesitated. I've only been here a year. But Dr. Patel might know. He's been here forever. Dr. Arvind Patel was in his 60s, with salt and pepper hair and the weary eyes of someone who had witnessed too much suffering. When Liam explained their search, he nodded thoughtfully. Carter, yes, I remember him. Remarkable man. He led them to a cramped office lined with overstuffed filing cabinets. Before the electronic system, we kept paper records. His should still be here somewhere. As Dr. Patel searched, Liam studied the photographs on the wall, groups of staff members through the years, standing before the building in its better days. There, Sophie suddenly said, pointing. In one faded photograph, barely visible in the back row, stood Ethan. He looked thinner than they remembered, his face gone, but his eyes still held that gentle intensity they knew so well. That was our volunteer group, 2018, Dr. Patel said, following her gaze. Even as a patient, he insisted on helping others. He would read to patients who had no visitors, help feed those who couldn't manage themselves. He was a patient and a volunteer? Liam asked, something cold settling in his stomach. Dr. Patel nodded. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He was admitted for pain management in early 2018. Refused any extraordinary measures. He pulled a thick folder from a drawer. Here we are. Carter, Ethan. They gathered around a small table as Dr. Patel laid out the contents of the folder. Medical charts documented Ethan's rapid decline, weight loss, increasing doses of morphine, complications from previous untreated conditions. Consultation notes revealed he had first been diagnosed 2 years earlier but had refused most treatments. This doesn't make sense, Liam said, physician's eyes scanning the records with growing horror. He had options. Early intervention might have. Might have what? Sophie interrupted, her voice taut with emotion. Extended his life? At what cost? Look at the dates, Liam. When was he first diagnosed? Liam flipped through the pages. October 2016. And what were we doing then? Sophie pulled out her phone, scrolling through her calendar archive. I was launching the Chicago project. You were setting up your first clinic. Her voice broke. He was dying, and we were too busy to notice he'd stopped calling. Dr. Patel cleared his throat gently. If I may, he spoke of you both often. With immense pride. He didn't want you to know he was ill. Why? Liam demanded, anger flaring suddenly. We could have helped him. I have colleagues, the best oncologists in the country. He left something for you, Dr. Patel said, reaching deeper into the folder. He withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. He asked that this be given to you if you ever came looking for him. The envelope was addressed simply, Liam and Sophie. With trembling fingers, Sophie broke the seal and pulled out several pages covered in Ethan's handwriting, steadier than his last journal entries, written before the disease had weakened him so severely. My dear children, if you're reading this, you've finally started looking for me. Part of me hopes you never do, that your lives remain untouched by the messy reality of mine. But I know you too well. Once you set your minds to something, you're unstoppable. You always were. First, I want you to know that whatever you're feeling right now, anger, guilt, confusion, it's unnecessary. I made my choices freely and never regretted them for a moment. You're probably wondering why I didn't tell you I was sick. Why I didn't ask for your help. The truth is complicated, but I'll try to explain. Do you remember that winter when Liam had pneumonia? You were 12, Sophie was 9. We were living in that one-room apartment above the laundromat. The doctor said Liam needed antibiotics, but I didn't have insurance, and the prescription cost $89.53. I remember the exact amount because it was almost all I had. That night, I had to choose medicine for Liam or rent for the apartment. It wasn't really a choice at all. We lost the apartment, but Liam recovered. Life is full of such calculations. Resources are finite. They must be allocated where they will do the most good. When the doctors told me about the cancer, they also told me the costs. Even with charity programs, the surgeries, chemotherapy, and experimental treatments would cost tens of thousands of dollars. Money that could shelter a dozen families. Money that could fund scholarships. Money that could do so much more good than buying a few more months for an old man who had already lived a full life. I chose differently this time. Not out of nobility or sacrifice, but because it was the rational decision. Sophie looked up from the letter, tears streaming down her face. He thought his life wasn't worth saving, she whispered. Liam, medical training warring with emotional devastation, continued reading aloud where she had left off. I know what you're thinking, especially you, Liam. That I gave up. That I didn't fight. But consider this, what were we really fighting for during all those years on the streets? Not just survival. We were fighting for meaning. Purpose. The chance to make a difference. And you've both done that, beyond my wildest dreams. Everything I couldn't accomplish in my life, you've achieved in yours. Every patient you heal, Liam, every family Sophie helps find stability, that's my legacy too. There's something else you should know. Something I've never told anyone. Before I found you both that night in the alley, I had decided it would be my last night alive. I had lost everything, my career, my home, my purpose. The pain from my injuries was unbearable, and the painkillers that had once been prescribed to me had become a different kind of pain. Then I heard Sophie crying. You didn't just save each other that night. You saved me. The 15 years I spent raising you were a gift I never expected to receive. Every hardship was worth it. Every sacrifice was a privilege. Now, a small confession. I did use some of your financial help over the years, though not in the way you intended. Those checks you sent, I donated them in your names to causes I knew you cared about. I hope you'll forgive this final act of paternal presumption. If you're determined to find me, to see me one last time, please don't. Remember me as I was, the man who taught you to ride bikes using borrowed bicycles in empty parking lots. The man who quizzed you on anatomy using textbooks salvaged from dumpsters. The man who was blessed beyond measure to be your father in all ways that matter. I love you both, infinitely and eternally. Ethan. Silence filled the small office as Liam finished reading. Dr. Patel discreetly wiped his eyes. There's more, Sophie said, turning to the next page. It wasn't part of the letter but appeared to be a page torn from Ethan's journal. Final arrangements. Body donated to University Medical Center. Contact Dr. Gregory Weinstein. Personal effects. Donate clothing. Books to the shelter on 43rd Street. Bank account. Citizens Trust. Account hashtag 745-112-9086. Password. Liam Sophie 2004. All remaining funds to be donated to Matthew's outreach. Storage unit, City Storage number 219. Key with Mrs. Winters. Liam stared at the last entry. He left us his money? I thought he had nothing. May I? Dr. Patel asked, gently taking the journal page. I believe I can explain this. He pulled out another document from Ethan's file, a payment record. He was part of a clinical trial in his final months. They paid participants a stipend. He never touched it. When did he? Sophie couldn't finish the question. July 17, 2019, Dr. Patel said softly. He was not in pain at the end. I made certain of that. And his body? Liam's medical detachment was failing him now. As he wished, it was donated to the medical school. They would have records of the final disposition. Sophie suddenly straightened, wiping her eyes. The storage unit. We need to go there. City Storage was across town, a sprawling complex of identical metal units stretching in rows like a miniature city. The night manager was initially reluctant to let them access unit number 219 without proper documentation, but a combination of Liam's medical credentials, Sophie's legal team on speakerphone, and a generous donation to the manager's retirement fund eventually convinced him. The storage unit was small, barely 10 feet square, and contained only 3 items: a battered desk, a filing cabinet, and a large trunk. That's the desk from our apartment, Sophie said, running her hand over the scarred surface. He taught us to write at this desk. Liam pulled open the filing cabinet drawers, finding them meticulously organized with folders labeled by year. Inside were report cards, crude childhood drawings, school projects, a complete archive of their lives. He kept everything, Liam whispered, holding up a science fair ribbon from 5th grade. The trunk was locked, but the key on the ring the manager had given them fit perfectly. Inside, wrapped carefully in acid-free paper, were photo albums, letters, and a small wooden box. Sophie opened the box and gasped. Inside lay Ethan's medical school ring and hospital ID badge from his days as a surgeon, along with a folded document, his medical license, never surrendered despite his fall from grace. Beneath everything in the trunk was a large manila envelope. Written on the front, in Ethan's careful script, "The complete truth." With shaking hands, Liam opened it and pulled out a thick sheaf of medical records, not Ethan's, but his own and Sophie's, dating back to their childhood. "What is this?" Sophie asked, peering over his shoulder. Liam flipped through the pages, medical understanding dawning in his eyes. "These are genetic tests," he said slowly. "DNA profiles. Why would he have those?" Liam continued reading, his expression growing increasingly stunned. "Sophie," he said finally, looking up at his sister with wide eyes. "These aren't just any tests. They're paternity tests." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Liam replied, his voice barely above a whisper, "that Ethan Carter was our biological father." The revelation left them reeling. The drive back to Liam's penthouse apartment was silent, both siblings lost in their own thoughts, the trunk of documents between them like a time bomb of unprocessed emotions. "It doesn't make sense," Sophie finally said as they sat surrounded by papers spread across Liam's living room floor. "If he was our biological father, why keep it secret? Why the elaborate story about finding us abandoned?" Liam studied a faded photograph they'd found in the trunk, a much younger Ethan with his arm around a smiling woman. On the back was written, "Emma and me, Cancun, 2003. Mom's name was Emma," he said quietly. "I remember that much. But I don't understand," Sophie insisted, her voice rising with frustration. "If they were together, if we were a family, what happened? How did we end up on the streets with him?" The answer came from a sealed envelope at the bottom of the trunk, marked, "For when you're ready to know everything." Inside was a handwritten account that read like a confession. "I met your mother in medical school. She was brilliant, a researcher with a passion for neuropharmacology. We married young, had Liam, and 2 years later Sophie. Our life seemed perfect. Then came the accident. A drunk driver hit my car head-on. 3 surgeries later, I was left with chronic pain and an addiction to the opiates prescribed to manage it. I lost my surgical privileges when I was caught falsifying prescriptions. Your mother tried to help, but I was too far gone. She finally gave me an ultimatum: get clean or she would take you both and leave. I promised to try, but addiction is a powerful demon. The night she caught me stealing her research medications was the night she packed your bags and left. I followed her, desperate to make amends. I found her car abandoned near Westlake Park. The police said there was no evidence of foul play, just a woman who wanted to disappear with her children. They assumed she had arranged transportation and left town. The truth was far worse. I found you both 3 days later, alone in that alley. You told me your mother had gone for medicine and never returned. I searched everywhere, filed missing persons reports. 6 weeks later, they found her body in the river. The official ruling was accidental drowning, but I've always wondered if my actions drove her to. I couldn't tell you the truth then. How do you tell children that their father's addiction drove their mother away and possibly to her death? That you were the reason they ended up alone in an alley? It seemed kinder to be the homeless stranger who found you, rather than the father who destroyed your family. By the time you were old enough to understand, the lie had become our reality. Coming clean would have meant admitting years of deception. So I remained Ethan, the homeless man who took you in, not Ethan, the father who failed you both so completely. He wasn't protecting us from the truth, Sophie whispered, tears streaming down her face. He was punishing himself. All those years living on the edge of society. Liam added, it wasn't just circumstances. It was penance. Dawn was breaking when they finished going through the trunk's contents. The final piece was a small notebook containing addresses and contact information for people from Ethan's past. Among them was Gregory Weinstein, the doctor who had received Ethan's anatomical donation. Dr. Weinstein's office at the University Medical Center was austere and clinical, with anatomy charts replacing the family photos that typically adorned doctors' walls. Ethan Carter, he mused when they explained their search. Yes, I remember him well. Not many donors arrive with a complete medical history and a letter of introduction. He tapped at his computer. His remains were cremated following the student's work. As per his instructions, no memorial service was held. Where is he now? Sophie asked, her voice small. Dr. Weinstein looked uncomfortable. That's the difficulty. Typically, unclaimed remains are interred in a common plot at Greenwood Cemetery. There's a marker, but it only displays a number, not a name. Unclaimed? Liam echoed, indignation rising. We would have claimed him. His paperwork specifically instructed us not to contact anyone, Dr. Weinstein explained. He listed no next of kin. The cemetery was on the outskirts of the city, its newer sections well maintained with neat rows of headstones. But Dr. Weinstein led them to an older area, where a simple granite block stood in the center of an open field. The communal memorial, he explained. Individual cremains are interred in the ground around it, with only a small numbered marker. He consulted a map, then led them to a small bronze disc set flush with the ground. Anatomical donor number 1294. It read. Nothing more. Sophie knelt beside the marker, touching it gently. He deserves better than this, she said, her voice breaking. After everything he did for us, for everyone, he can't just be a number. Liam crouched beside her, his own grief finally breaking through his professional composure. He died alone, Sophie. While we were accepting awards and opening clinics, he was here dying alone. Not entirely alone, a voice said behind them. They turned to find an elderly man leaning on a cane, watching them with rheumy eyes. Pardon me, he said. I couldn't help overhearing. You're talking about Ethan Carter? You knew him? Sophie asked, rising quickly. I was his roommate at St. Francis for a while. The man extended a gnarled hand. George Pearson. Ethan read to me every evening when my eyesight started failing. Poetry, mostly. You were with him? Liam asked. At the end? George nodded. Right up until his last day. The nurses tried to make him comfortable, but there's only so much they can do in a place like that. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. He talked about you both. All the time. Had your pictures by his bed. Why didn't he call us? Sophie asked, the question that had been haunting her for weeks. We would have come immediately. He didn't want you to see him that way. George replied simply. He said you had your own lives to live, your own families forming. That his greatest achievement was raising you to not need him anymore. The same words from the journal. Hearing them from someone else made them even more painful. He left something with me. George continued, reaching into his pocket. Said if you ever came looking I should give you this. He handed Sophie a folded piece of paper, creased and yellowed with age. It was the missing last page from Ethan's journal. My final thoughts as I write this, I've had a blessed life. Not the one I imagined as a young doctor, certainly. The path was harder, the challenges greater. But I found my true purpose in raising you both. They say no one on their deathbed wishes they'd spent more time at the office. I have no such regrets. Every moment I spent with you, helping with homework by candlelight when we couldn't pay the electric bill, teaching you to swim in the public pool during the free hours, watching you grow into the remarkable people you've become, those were the richest moments of my life. My one regret is the truth I never told you. Perhaps you'll never know I was your father by blood as well as by choice. Perhaps that's for the best. I failed you once, catastrophically. Everything that came after was my attempt to make amends. If you do somehow discover the truth, please know this. Finding you in that alley wasn't coincidence or fate. It was a father, broken and desperate, searching for his children. What came after wasn't nobility or sacrifice. It was love, plain and simple. I love you, my children. I have always loved you. And wherever I am now, I am watching over you with immeasurable pride. Dad. That single word, Dad, the one he had never allowed them to call him, broke something open inside Sophie. She collapsed against Liam, sobbing uncontrollably. George watched them with compassion. He wasn't alone at the end, he said softly. I held his hand. His last words were your names. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows across the unmarked grave, Liam and Sophie sat in silence, processing not just the loss of Ethan but the rewriting of their entire history. All these years, Liam finally said, I thought we were his charity. His good deed. We were his redemption, Sophie replied. And he was ours. They placed flowers on the small bronze marker, wildflowers picked from the edge of the cemetery, the kind Ethan had taught them to identify during their walks through city parks. Not the expensive bouquets they could now easily afford, but the simple blooms that had brightened countless makeshift homes throughout their childhood. We can't leave him here, Liam said firmly. Not like this. Not as a number. Sophie nodded, determination replacing grief in her eyes. No, we can't. And we won't. As they walked back to the car, she paused to look back at the small marker, nearly invisible in the fading light. He spent his life being invisible for our sake, she said. No more. The Matthews Foundation headquarters buzzed with unusual activity for a Sunday. Staff members who would normally be enjoying their weekends had responded to an urgent all-hands meeting called by both founders. The boardroom, typically reserved for donor presentations and strategy sessions, was now command central for what Sophie had dubbed Operation Ethan. I don't understand, said Marcus Chin, the foundation's legal director, studying the documents spread before him. You want to exhume remains from a communal grave? The bureaucratic hurdles alone. We're not asking if it's difficult, Liam interrupted, his normally patient demeanor replaced by fierce determination. We're asking you to make it happen. Whatever it costs, whatever strings need pulling. Sophie laid a hand on her brother's arm, then addressed the room. What my brother means is that this is our top priority. Everything else can wait. The team exchanged glances. They had never seen the siblings like this, Sophie without her carefully crafted diplomacy, Liam without his clinical detachment. Something profound had changed. Of course, Marcus nodded. I'll contact Judge Hernandez. She owes me a favor. As the team dispersed with their assignments, Sophie sank into a chair, physical and emotional exhaustion finally catching up with her. Do you think we're doing the right thing? Ethan was always so private. Maybe he wouldn't want all this attention. Liam looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below, the same city where they had once huddled in doorways with Ethan, seeking shelter from the rain. He didn't want to be a burden in life. That doesn't mean he should be forgotten in death. While the legal team worked on recovering Ethan's remains, Liam and Sophie began the monumental task of readjusting their understanding of their past. They revisited places from their childhood: the park where Ethan had taught them chess using pieces carved from soap, the library where he'd helped them with homework, the community clinic where he'd volunteered in exchange for their medical care. I never understood how he knew so much, Sophie said as they stood outside the clinic. He could explain anything: science, history, literature. I thought he was just naturally brilliant. He was, Liam replied. But he was also Dr. Ethan Carter, top of his class at Johns Hopkins. He held up an old newspaper clipping they'd found in the trunk, a young Ethan accepting a research award. He could have been one of the greats. He was one of the greats, Sophie corrected firmly. Just not in the way anyone expected. 3 weeks after beginning their search, they received the call they'd been waiting for. The exhumation had been approved, and Ethan's remains identified through DNA testing against Liam and Sophie. Now, they could finally give their father the memorial he deserved. But that was just the beginning. We've secured the property, reported Alicia, the Foundation's operations director, during their daily briefing. The old St. Catherine's Hospital in the East District. It's been abandoned for years, but the structure is sound. Sophie nodded, studying the blueprints. How quickly can we renovate? With expedited permits and round-the-clock construction? 3 months minimum. We need it in 6 weeks, Liam said, not looking up from his laptop. The anniversary of his death is July 17th. The team exchanged worried glances, but Sophie simply nodded. 6 weeks it is. Double the crews, triple if necessary. What they were planning went far beyond a memorial, or even a funeral. It would be, in Sophie's words, a fundamental reimagining of how we honor those who sacrifice everything. Liam, meanwhile, had taken a leave of absence from his medical practice to focus on another aspect of their tribute. He'd sequestered himself with a team of researchers, poring over Ethan's old medical records and journals. He was self-medicating his chronic pain, Liam explained during a rare dinner with Sophie. But look at these notes he made. He was tracking efficacy, side effects, developing his own pain management protocols. For himself? Sophie asked. Liam shook his head. For others. He was developing treatment plans for homeless patients with chronic pain, alternatives to opiates that wouldn't lead to the addiction that destroyed his life. And did they work? Some did. Liam's eyes gleamed with the excitement of discovery. In fact, several of his approaches were ahead of their time. With modern resources and proper trials. He trailed off, lost in possibilities. News of their project began to leak, as it inevitably would. The media seized on the story. The homeless hero who had raised 2 of society's most prominent figures, now revealed to be their biological father. Public interest exploded. We need to control this narrative, urged their PR director. People are fascinated. This could be huge for fundraising. This is not about fundraising, Sophie said sharply. This is about setting something right. Despite their desire for privacy, they recognized the power of Ethan's story. If sharing it could help others, wasn't that what he would have wanted? They agreed to a single television interview, where they revealed the full truth for the first time. Our father wasn't just homeless, Liam told the interviewer, his voice steady despite the camera's unflinching gaze. He chose poverty to give us a chance at life. He was a brilliant doctor who lost everything to addiction and grief, then rebuilt his soul through sacrifice. He could have reclaimed his identity at any time, Sophie added. Returned to medicine in some capacity. But he stayed invisible because that's what protected us. And now? The interviewer prompted. Now we ensure he's never invisible again, Liam replied. On July 17th, exactly 5 years after Ethan's death, they unveiled their tribute. The abandoned hospital had been transformed into the Ethan Carter Center for Homeless Health and Dignity, a revolutionary facility combining medical care, transitional housing, addiction treatment, and education. The lobby featured a life-size bronze statue of Ethan, not in a doctor's coat, but in the humble clothes he'd worn on the streets, a book in one hand, the other extended in welcome. The inscription read simply, "Ethan Carter, father, healer, teacher. His sacrifice saved not just 2 children, but countless lives through their work." The center's crowning achievement was the Ethan Carter Pain Management Clinic, where Liam had implemented and expanded his father's protocols. Already, the results were promising: reduced opioid dependency rates, improved quality of life for chronic pain sufferers, and critically, treatment accessible to those without insurance or permanent addresses. The true cost of chronic pain isn't measured in dollars, Liam explained during the dedication ceremony. It's measured in lost potential, in shattered families, in dreams deferred. My father paid that price. No one else should have to. Sophie's contribution was equally significant. The center included what she called the Dignity Project, a comprehensive approach to homeless rights combining legal advocacy, healthcare access, and policy reform. Teams of lawyers, social workers, and former homeless individuals worked together to navigate the bureaucratic labyrinth that so often trapped people in cycles of poverty. When a man like Ethan Carter falls through the cracks, Sophie told the assembled crowd, we don't just lose a doctor or a father. We lose every life he might have touched, every innovation he might have created, every problem he might have solved. Society cannot afford such losses. The media coverage was extensive, but what mattered most to Liam and Sophie were the people standing at the back of the crowd: George Pearson from the hospice, Marvin from the shelter, Mrs. Winters from the boarding house, and dozens of others whose lives had intersected with Ethan's. People who had seen him not as a failure or a statistic, but as a man of quiet dignity who had never stopped helping others despite his circumstances. After the speeches and the ribbon-cutting, after the tours and the interviews, Liam and Sophie slipped away to a small private garden at the center of the facility. There, in a peaceful courtyard designed for healing, stood a simple black granite headstone. Ethan Michael Carter, MD 1960 to 2019, beloved father, healer, teacher. His sacrifice saved us all. Beneath the headstone lay Ethan's ashes, finally given the resting place he deserved. Sophie placed a bouquet of wildflowers at the base. I keep thinking about what he wrote, that his greatest achievement was raising us to not need him anymore. He was wrong about that, Liam said softly. We've always needed him. We just didn't know it. As they stood in silence, the setting sun cast long shadows across the garden. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the center coming to life: voices, gentle laughter, the fundamental noises of healing beginning. Do you think he would approve? Sophie asked, suddenly uncertain. All of this attention, this recognition? Liam considered the question, then smiled slightly. I think he'd be mortified by the statue. But the work? Helping people who have no one else? Giving them back their dignity? He nodded slowly. Yeah, I think he'd approve of that. To Ethan Carter, Sophie whispered, touching the headstone one last time. Father to many. To Dad, Liam corrected gently. Father to us. 5 years passed since the opening of the Ethan Carter Center. What had begun as one building in one city had evolved into a nationwide movement. 17 centers now operated across the country, each adapting the core model to local needs while maintaining the essential philosophy, treating homelessness not as a character flaw but as a treatable condition, with dignity at the center of all interventions. On a bitterly cold December morning, a man named Michael Reeves shuffled through the doors of the original center, his weathered face partially hidden by a ragged scarf. His hands, red and chapped from exposure, clutched a worn backpack containing everything he owned. At 62, he had spent nearly 2 decades on the streets after losing his construction business to the economic collapse of 2008. The security guard nodded respectfully as Michael entered. No demands for ID, no suspicious once-over, just a simple acknowledgement of his humanity. It was one of the center's foundational principles, established by Sophie from day one. Everyone who entered was treated first and foremost as a person worthy of respect. Michael had heard about this place from others on the streets, but skepticism had kept him away. Too many promises had been broken, too many programs had failed him over the years. But the increasing pain in his leg, possibly broken from a fall 2 weeks earlier, had finally overcome his reluctance. "First time here?" asked the receptionist, a woman with kind eyes and a smile that seemed genuine. Michael nodded, bracing for the inevitable paperwork, the questions he couldn't answer, the proof of residence he couldn't provide. "Welcome," she said simply, sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk. "We just need a name, whatever you'd like us to call you, and your most urgent need today. Medical care? Food? Shower? Rest?" Michael stared at the form in disbelief. "That's it. That's it for now," she confirmed. "We believe in addressing immediate needs first. Everything else can wait." As he wrote Michael on the form and checked medical, with a shaking hand, he glanced up at the massive portrait hanging behind the reception desk. It showed a man with gentle eyes and a weathered face not unlike his own. Beneath the portrait were the words, "His sacrifice saved us." "Who is that?" Michael asked, gesturing to the portrait. "That's Dr. Ethan Carter," the receptionist replied. "The father of our founders. This whole place exists because of him." Before Michael could inquire further, a medical assistant arrived to guide him to the urgent care clinic. The doctor who examined him, a young woman with an easy manner and careful hands, confirmed that his leg was indeed fractured. "We'll need to set this," she explained. "And you'll need proper rest and follow-up care for it to heal correctly." Michael sighed, preparing to leave. A fracture meant weeks of recovery, impossible on the streets. "Just wrap it tight," he said. "I'll manage." The doctor shook her head. "That's not how we work here. We have recovery beds upstairs. You'll stay until you're healed." "I can't afford." "There's no charge," she interrupted gently. "That's not how we work either." After his leg was set and cast, Michael was wheeled to an elevator that took him to the recovery floor. Unlike the institutional settings he'd encountered before, this space felt almost homelike. Private rooms with actual doors instead of curtains, windows with views of the city, even small personal touches like reading lamps and bookshelves. "Someone will bring dinner in about an hour," the nurse explained, helping him settle into the bed. "Is there anything else you need now?" Michael glanced at the bookshelf. "Maybe something to read?" The nurse smiled. "Any preferences?" "Anything but self-help," Michael replied with a hint of his old humor. "I've had enough people trying to fix me." Later, as he leafed through a well-worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea, while eating the first hot meal he'd had in weeks, Michael noticed a small plaque on the wall of his room. It read, "This recovery bed sponsored in memory of George Pearson, who knew the healing power of human connection." The name stirred something in his memory, but exhaustion soon overcame him, and he fell into the deepest sleep he'd had in years. The next morning, after a shower and breakfast, Michael was invited to join an optional group session in the community room. Still wary but with nowhere else to go, he attended, surprised to find it wasn't the typical addiction or mental health therapy he'd expected. Instead, residents were discussing their skills, their past work experiences, their dreams before homelessness had intervened. "We believe everyone has something to contribute," explained the facilitator. "Our job is helping you remember what that is, and finding ways to use it again." When it was his turn, Michael reluctantly mentioned his background in construction. "Not that it matters now," he added bitterly. "No one hires 62-year-old homeless contractors." "Actually," the facilitator replied, "we're currently looking for someone to teach basic construction skills in our vocational program. Would that interest you?" Before Michael could respond, the door opened and a tall man in his late 40s entered the room. Something about him commanded attention, not in an intimidating way, but with a quiet authority that reminded Michael of the best foreman he'd worked with. "Everyone, this is Dr. Matthews," the facilitator announced. "He founded this center with his sister." "Just Liam, please," the man corrected with an easy smile. "I'm visiting from our Boston location and wanted to see how everyone's doing here." As Liam moved around the room, speaking individually with residents, Michael studied him. There was something familiar about his features, something that nagged at the edge of his memory. When Liam reached him, he extended his hand warmly. "I'm Liam. I don't think we've met." "Michael," he replied, shaking the offered hand. "Just got here yesterday." Liam glanced at his cast. "Dr. Chen's work? She's excellent. You're in good hands." "Everyone keeps saying that," Michael said, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. "Good hands? But nothing's free in this world. What's the catch?" Instead of being offended, Liam smiled. "The catch is that once you're healed, we'll ask if you want to contribute something back. Not money, time, skills, whatever you can offer. But it's completely voluntary. And if I just take the free care and leave? Then I hope your leg heals well and you find what you're looking for." Liam replied simply. "We don't attach strings to basic human dignity." Something about those words, about the man's entire demeanor, triggered a distant memory. Michael glanced up at a smaller version of the portrait he'd seen in the lobby, hanging on the community room wall. "That man," he said, pointing to the portrait. "I knew him." Liam's expression changed instantly. "You knew Ethan Carter?" Michael nodded slowly as the memories crystallized. "Not by that name. We called him Doc, even though he never said he was one. This must be 20 years ago now. He used to hang around the underpass where a bunch of us camped. Brought supplies sometimes. Bandaged people up. Taught me how to clean wounds with the little alcohol wipes from fast food places." Liam pulled up a chair, his full attention now focused on Michael. "When was this exactly? Do you remember? Had to be around 2003, 2004 maybe? He had 2 kids with him sometimes. A boy and a girl." Michael studied Liam's face more carefully. "The boy was you?" Liam nodded, visibly moved. "And my sister Sophie. We're trying to collect stories about him, about his life. Would you be willing to share what you remember?" Over the next hour, as the group session continued around them, Michael recounted his memories of Doc, how he'd set up an informal clinic under the highway overpass every Sunday, treating infections, wrapping sprains, distributing medications when he could get them. How he'd read to an old Vietnam vet who was going blind. How he'd once stayed up all night with a woman in withdrawal, talking her through the worst of it. He always said his children would change the world. Michael finished. "Looks like he was right." Liam's eyes glistened. "We're trying," he said softly. "Every day, we're trying." In the weeks that followed, as Michael's leg healed, he found himself drawn deeper into the center's community. He began helping with small maintenance tasks he could manage with his cast, then advising on a renovation project for the new family wing. By the time he was physically recovered, he had accepted the position teaching basic construction skills to other residents. 6 months later, Michael had his own apartment in the center's transitional housing complex and was supervising the construction training program. On the anniversary of the center's opening, he stood with Liam and Sophie as they unveiled a new wing dedicated to preventive care for the homeless population. 10 years ago, Sophie addressed the gathered crowd. "We discovered that our father had died alone and forgotten, despite everything he had given to this world. We promised then that we would create a place where no one would be forgotten, where everyone's contribution would be valued, where dignity wasn't a luxury but a right. Today," Liam continued, "we're not just celebrating a building or a program. We're celebrating a shift in how we see each other. Every person who comes through our doors has a story, has value, has something to offer." As they spoke, Michael found himself looking at the portrait of Ethan Carter, the man he had known briefly as Doc, and thinking about the strange circular journey that had brought him here. The man in the portrait had bandaged his wounds 2 decades ago. Now, Michael was helping to build the legacy that honored him. After the ceremony, as staff and residents gathered for a community dinner, Michael approached Liam and Sophie. "I've been thinking about what you told me, about collecting stories of your father. We're creating an oral history," Sophie explained, "trying to piece together the parts of his life we missed. I may know others who encountered him," Michael offered, "from the old underpass days. Some of them are still out there. I could try to find them, record their stories." Liam clasped his shoulder. "We'd be grateful. Every story brings back a piece of him." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Michael paused before Ethan's portrait in the main lobby. A young family had just been admitted, a mother and 2 small children who had been living in their car. He watched as they were welcomed, fed, and settled into the family emergency housing wing with quiet dignity and respect. "You were right, Doc," he whispered to the portrait. "Your children did change the world. And through them, you're still saving people. Even old broken-down guys like me." As if in response, the last rays of the setting sun broke through the lobby windows, illuminating the portrait in a warm golden glow. For just a moment, it seemed as though Ethan Carter smiled back at him, not the solemn figure captured in bronze and paint, but the real man who had once sat beside Michael under a highway overpass, sharing a meager meal and speaking of a better future he would never live to see. A future that, thanks to his forgotten sacrifice, had finally arrived.